The evening sun was setting behind the tall buildings when Detective Maria Rodriguez finished her shift. She had been working undercover for 3 months, trying to catch drug dealers in the downtown area. Her job required her to dress like a regular person, not like a police officer. Today she wore a simple black skirt, white blouse, and comfortable shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was a law enforcement officer. Maria was tired after a long day of pretending to be someone else. Being undercover meant she couldn't carry her badge openly or wear her uniform. Instead, she kept her police identification and service weapon hidden on her body, just like she had been trained to do. The department had taught all undercover officers to always be prepared, even when they looked like ordinary citizens. As she walked down Oak Street toward her car, Maria noticed the neighborhood was quieter than usual. Most of the shops had already closed and only a few people were still walking around. The streetlights were just beginning to turn on, creating long shadows on the sidewalk. She pulled her jacket a little tighter around her shoulders and quickened her pace. 2 police officers were sitting in their patrol car near the corner of Oak Street and Main Avenue. Officer Jake Miller and Officer Tony Davis had been partners for 2 years. They were supposed to be watching for any suspicious activity in the area, but instead, they were talking about their weekend plans and drinking coffee from the convenience store. Jake was the older of the two, with 15 years of experience on the force. He had developed some bad habits over the years and often made inappropriate comments about people they encountered during their shifts. Tony was newer to the job, but he had started copying Jake's behavior because he wanted to fit in with his partner. When Jake saw Maria walking alone on the sidewalk, he nudged Tony and pointed in her direction. "Look at that woman over there," he said with a smirk. "She looks like she's lost or something. Maybe we should go talk to her." Tony looked where Jake was pointing and saw Maria walking quickly down the street. "She doesn't look like she's doing anything wrong," he replied. But Jake was already opening the car door. "Come on, rookie," Jake said, using the nickname he had given Tony even though he wasn't really new anymore. "Let's go have some fun. This neighborhood can be boring, and we need some entertainment." The 2 officers got out of their patrol car and started walking toward Maria. She noticed them approaching but didn't think much of it at first. Police officers walked around the neighborhood all the time, and she assumed they were just doing their regular patrol duties. But as they got closer, Maria could tell something was different about the way they were walking toward her. Their body language seemed aggressive, and they were smiling in a way that made her uncomfortable. She had been a police officer long enough to recognize when someone had bad intentions. "Evening, miss," Jake called out when they were still about 10 feet away from her. "You look like you might need some help." "Are you lost?" Maria stopped walking and turned to face them. She could see now that both officers were young, and seemed to think this was some kind of game. "No, I'm fine, thank you," she replied politely. "I'm just heading home." "Are you sure about that?" Tony asked, stepping a little closer. "This neighborhood can be dangerous for a woman walking alone. Maybe you should let us give you a ride somewhere safe." Maria knew exactly what was happening. She had heard stories from other female officers about situations like this. Some male officers, especially ones who thought no one was watching, would sometimes harass women they encountered on the street. It was a serious problem that the department had been trying to address for years. "I appreciate your concern," Maria said, keeping her voice calm and steady. "But I live nearby, and I know this area well. I'll be fine walking." She started to turn away, hoping the officers would leave her alone and go back to their patrol car. But Jake wasn't ready to end the conversation. He had decided that this woman needed to be taught a lesson about showing proper respect to police officers. "Hold on there," Jake said, moving to block her path. "We're trying to help you, and you're being pretty rude about it. Don't you think you should be more grateful when officers of the law are trying to keep you safe?" Maria felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her expression neutral. She had been trained to stay calm in dangerous situations, and she recognized that this was definitely becoming dangerous. "I do appreciate what police officers do," she said carefully, "but I really need to get home now." Tony was watching Jake carefully, waiting to see what his partner would do next. He knew that Jake sometimes went too far with people, but he had never stopped him before. He was afraid that if he spoke up, Jake would think he was weak or not a good partner. "You know what I think?" Jake said, stepping even closer to Maria. "I think you need to learn some manners. Young women these days don't show enough respect for authority figures. Maybe we need to teach you a lesson. Maria's mind was racing. She could reveal her identity right now and end this situation immediately. But she also realized that this might be exactly the kind of behavior that other women in the community had been complaining about. If she stopped it now, these officers might just be more careful next time. They wouldn't learn that their behavior was wrong. I think you should step back, Maria said firmly. I haven't done anything wrong and you have no reason to detain me. Jake laughed and looked at Tony. Listen to her acting like she knows about the law. I bet she watches too many police shows on TV. He turned back to Maria with a nasty expression on his face. Let me tell you something about the law, sweetheart. Out here on the street, we are the law. The situation was escalating quickly and Maria knew she had to make a decision. She could feel the weight of her service weapon against her leg, hidden beneath her skirt. Her badge was there too, clipped to the inside of her waistband where no one could see it. Jake reached out as if he was going to grab Maria's arm. She stepped back quickly, but there wasn't much room to move. Behind her was a brick wall and the two officers were standing in front of her, blocking her path to the street. Please leave me alone, Maria said, her voice getting louder. I want to go home and you have no legal right to stop me. But Jake had already decided how this encounter was going to end. He wanted to humiliate this woman who had dared to talk back to him. He wanted to show her that he had power over her, and he wanted his partner to see him assert that power. What happened next would change everything for all three people standing on that quiet street corner. Jake moved closer to Maria with a cruel smile on his face. He had done this kind of thing before with other women, and no one had ever stopped him. In his mind, he was just having a little fun, and what harm could it really do? He didn't think about how it would make the woman feel, or whether what he was doing was right or wrong. You know what your problem is? Jake said to Maria, his voice getting meaner. You think you're better than everyone else. You think you can just walk around here without showing proper respect to the people who keep this neighborhood safe? Tony shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. Something about this situation didn't feel right to him, but he had never stood up to Jake before. He was afraid that if he said something now, Jake would make his life difficult at work. So he just stood there and watched, even though a small voice in his head was telling him to stop what was happening. Maria kept her back straight and looked directly at both officers. She had been in dangerous situations before during her police career, but this felt different. These were supposed to be her colleagues, people who had taken the same oath she had to serve and protect the community. Instead, they were treating her like she was their enemy. I haven't disrespected anyone, Maria said clearly. I've been polite to both of you, and I've asked you to let me continue on my way home. That's not unreasonable. But Jake wasn't listening to her words anymore. He was focused on the power he felt he had over this situation. In his mind, he was the one in control, and this woman needed to learn her place. He had forgotten all about his duty as a police officer and was only thinking about his own ego. Polite? Jake laughed harshly. You call this polite? Walking away from police officers when they're trying to talk to you? Acting like you're too good to answer our questions? He shook his head. I think you need a reality check. Maria could see what was about to happen. She had investigated cases like this before, where officers abused their power to humiliate innocent people. She had read reports and interviewed victims who described exactly this kind of behavior. Now she was experiencing it herself. Jake reached toward the hem of Maria's skirt with a disgusting grin on his face. Let's see if you're still acting so tough after this, he said. He thought he was about to embarrass a helpless civilian who would never be able to do anything about it. He expected her to scream or cry or beg him to stop. Tony watched in horror as his partner grabbed the bottom of Maria's skirt. He knew this was wrong, but he felt frozen in place. Part of him wanted to stop Jake, but another part of him was afraid of the consequences. He had seen what happened to officers who went against Jake, and it wasn't pretty. But as Jake lifted the fabric of Maria's skirt, his expression changed completely. Instead of seeing what he expected to see, he found himself staring at something that made his blood run cold. Strapped to Maria's thigh was a service weapon in a professional holster, and next to it was a police badge attached to her belt. Jake's hand dropped the skirt immediately, and he stumbled backward as if he had been hit. His face went from confident and cruel to terrified in less than a second. Tony saw his partner's reaction and stepped forward to see what had caused it. When he saw the gun and badge, his mouth fell open in shock. Oh no, Tony whispered, finally understanding what they had just done. Maria looked down at her exposed badge and weapon, then back up at the two officers who were now staring at her with wide eyes full of fear. She had been planning to reveal her identity eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen quite like this. "Detective Maria Rodriguez," she said in a calm, authoritative voice that was completely different from the tone she had been using before. "Internal Affairs Division, badge number 4782. The words hit Jake and Tony like a physical blow. Internal Affairs was the department that investigated police misconduct. These were the officers that every cop feared, the ones who had the power to end careers and send fellow officers to prison. And they had just assaulted one of them. Jake's face turned completely white. All of his confidence and arrogance disappeared in an instant, replaced by pure terror. He realized that his career was probably over, and worse than that, he might be facing serious criminal charges. Everything he had worked for during his 15 years on the force was about to disappear because of a few minutes of stupid behavior. "Detective, We didn't know," Jake stammered, but Maria held up her hand to stop him. "You didn't know what?" Maria asked, her voice still calm but now carrying the full authority of her position. "You didn't know that it was wrong to assault a woman on the street? You didn't know that police officers are supposed to protect people, not victimize them?" Tony felt like he might throw up. He had always known that Jake's behavior was questionable, but he had told himself that it wasn't really his problem. Now he realized that by staying silent and going along with his partner, he had become just as guilty as Jake was. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," Tony said, his voice shaking. "We made a terrible mistake. We thought you were just a regular citizen and we—" "You thought I was just a regular citizen," Maria repeated. "So that made it okay to treat me this way? Is that how you think police officers should treat regular citizens?" Tony realized how his words sounded and felt even worse. There was no good answer to Maria's question, because there was no excuse for what they had done. It didn't matter whether she was a police officer or a regular person. Their behavior had been completely wrong either way. Maria reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her cell phone. Both officers watched her movements carefully, wondering what she was going to do next. They were hoping she might be willing to forget about what had happened, to give them a second chance. But Maria had no intention of letting this slide. She had been working in internal affairs for 5 years, and she had seen too many cases where officers abused their power and got away with it. She knew that if she didn't take action now, Jake and Tony would just continue to treat other people the same way. "I want you both to know," Maria said as she held up her phone, "that this entire encounter has been recorded. From the moment you approached me until right now, everything has been captured on audio and video." Jake felt his knees go weak. A recording meant there would be undeniable proof of what they had done. There would be no way to lie about it or claim that it had been a misunderstanding. Their own words and actions would condemn them. "Recording?" Tony asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "You were recording us the whole time?" Maria nodded. "Standard procedure for undercover officers. We're always recording our interactions when we're in the field. It's for our own protection and to gather evidence when necessary." The two patrol officers looked at each other, both realizing that their situation was even worse than they had initially thought. Not only had they assaulted a fellow police officer, but there was video evidence of the entire incident. There would be no way to deny what had happened or to minimize their actions. Jake opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, he was completely speechless. The man who had been so confident and aggressive just minutes before now looked like a scared child who had been caught doing something terrible. Maria looked at both officers with an expression that was professional but stern. She had dealt with situations like this before, but it never got easier. These men had chosen to abuse their power and authority, and now they would have to face the consequences of their choices. The next few minutes would determine whether justice would be served or whether two corrupt officers would continue to terrorize innocent people in their community. Maria kept her phone in her hand and looked directly at both officers. The fear in their eyes was obvious now, but she knew that fear alone wouldn't change their behavior. She had seen too many cases where officers promised to do better, but went right back to their old ways as soon as they thought no one was watching. "Detective Rodriguez," Jake said, trying to make his voice sound normal even though it was shaking. "Maybe we can work something out here. This was just a misunderstanding. We were trying to help and things got out of hand." Maria raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" Is that what you call sexually assaulting a woman on a public street? Is that what you call threatening someone who hasn't committed any crime? Tony wiped sweat from his forehead even though the evening air was cool. We weren't trying to assault anyone. You were just what? Maria asked. Just having fun? Just showing me who was in charge? Just teaching me a lesson about respect? She shook her head. I've heard all of these excuses before, Officer Davis. They don't make what you did any less serious. The fact that she knew Tony's name made him even more nervous. If she knew who he was, that meant she could easily find out everything about his career, his record, and his personal life. Internal affairs officers had access to all kinds of information about their fellow cops. How do you know my name? Tony asked quietly. Maria smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Officer Anthony Davis, badge number 8834. 5 years on the force, assigned to the Downtown Patrol Division. 2 previous complaints filed against you for inappropriate conduct, both of which were dismissed due to lack of evidence. Tony's heart sank. Those complaints had been filed by women who claimed he had harassed them during traffic stops, but his supervisors had decided there wasn't enough proof to take action against him. He had thought those incidents were forgotten, but apparently Internal Affairs kept track of everything. And Officer Jacob Miller, Maria continued, turning to Jake. 15 years of service, badge number 2156. 7 complaints filed against you over the past 3 years. Verbal abuse, intimidation, excessive force, and inappropriate conduct with female citizens. Your supervisors have given you multiple warnings, but somehow you keep ending up in situations like this. Jake felt sick to his stomach. He had no idea that Internal Affairs had been keeping such detailed records about him. He thought he had been careful, that his behavior hadn't been noticed by anyone important. Now he realized that he had been wrong. You've been watching us, Jake said. It wasn't a question. Not just you two specifically, Maria replied, but this precinct has received an unusual number of complaints about officer misconduct over the past year. My department has been investigating reports of harassment, abuse of power, and violations of citizens' rights. We've been looking into patterns of behavior and trying to identify officers who might be causing problems. She paused and looked at both men. Congratulations. You've both made it onto our list of officers who require special attention. Tony felt like he was going to be sick. Special attention? What does that mean? It means that every call you respond to, every interaction you have with the public, and every report you file gets extra scrutiny from our department, Maria explained. It means that if even one more person complains about your behavior, you'll be facing serious disciplinary action. And after tonight, I'd say you're both well past that point. Jake tried one more time to salvage the situation. Detective, look, we made a mistake. A big mistake. But we're good cops. We've both served this community for years. Surely that has to count for something. Maria looked at him with disgust. Good cops? Officer Miller, good cops don't threaten innocent people. Good cops don't sexually assault women. Good cops don't abuse their authority to intimidate citizens who haven't done anything wrong. She held up her phone again, and good cops definitely don't do any of those things while being recorded by an internal affairs detective who was specifically investigating reports of misconduct in their precinct. The full reality of their situation was finally sinking in for both officers. This wasn't just a random encounter that had gone wrong. Maria hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been there as part of an official investigation, and they had walked right into her trap. This was a setup, Tony said, his voice barely audible. Not a setup, Maria corrected him. An investigation. We received multiple complaints about officers in this precinct harassing women, particularly women of color walking alone at night. The descriptions we got from the victims matched your behavior perfectly. She put her phone back in her pocket but kept her hand on it. What happened here tonight is exactly what we expected to find. The only surprise is that you made it so easy for us to document your behavior. Jake was starting to get angry now that the initial shock was wearing off. So this whole thing was fake? You were pretending to be a victim so you could entrap us? Maria's expression hardened. Officer Miller, I wasn't pretending to be anything. I was walking home from work minding my own business when you two decided to harass me. The fact that I happened to be a police officer doesn't change what you did. It just means you picked the wrong victim this time. She stepped closer to both men, and they instinctively backed away from her. How many other women have you treated this way? How many victims are out there who didn't have a badge and a gun to protect them? How many people have suffered because of your behavior? Tony was crying now, tears streaming down his face. We never hurt anyone seriously. We were just playing around. Playing around. Maria's voice was filled with anger. Do you think the women you terrorized were having fun? Do you think they went home and laughed about how 2 police officers made them feel helpless and afraid? She pulled out a small notebook and began writing in it. Let me tell you what's going to happen next. I'm going to call my supervisor and report this incident. You're both going to be suspended immediately pending a full investigation. The recording of tonight's events will be reviewed by the department's disciplinary board. Jake and Tony watched her write, knowing that each word she put on paper was sealing their fate. You'll both be facing criminal charges for assault and abuse of power, Maria continued. Your cases will be turned over to the district attorney's office for prosecution. And if you're convicted, you'll not only lose your jobs, but you'll also serve time in prison. She looked up from her notebook. The same prison where some of the people you've arrested are currently serving their sentences. I wonder how they'll feel about having a couple of corrupt cops as their new neighbors. The threat was clear, and both officers understood it. Cops who went to prison faced a particularly difficult time because many of the inmates they encountered had been arrested by police officers. They would be targets from the moment they walked through the prison doors. Please, Jake said, and for the first time since Maria had known him, his voice sounded genuinely humble. Isn't there something we can do? Some way to make this right? Maria closed her notebook and looked at both men with contempt. You had 15 years to make things right, Officer Miller. You had multiple warnings, multiple opportunities to change your behavior. Instead, you chose to keep abusing your power and hurting innocent people. She turned to Tony. And you, Officer Davis, could have stopped this at any time. You could have told your partner that his behavior was wrong. You could have reported him to your supervisors. Instead, you chose to participate and enable his actions. Both officers stood in silence, knowing that everything she said was true. They had made their choices, and now they would have to live with the consequences. Maria picked up her phone again and began dialing a number. Sergeant Williams? This is Detective Rodriguez. I need you to send a supervisor to Oak Street and Main Avenue immediately. I have 2 officers here who need to be placed under arrest. Within 10 minutes, 3 police cars arrived at the scene. The red and blue lights reflected off the buildings around them, creating an eerie atmosphere on the quiet street. Jake and Tony watched as their colleagues got out of the vehicles, knowing that word of their arrest would spread quickly through the entire department. Sergeant Lisa Williams was the first to approach Maria. She was a veteran officer with 25 years of experience and a reputation for being fair but tough. She had worked with internal affairs before and knew how serious these situations could be. Detective Rodriguez, Sergeant Williams said with a nod. What's the situation here? Maria handed her the notebook she had been writing in. These 2 officers sexually assaulted me and threatened me while I was walking home from my undercover assignment. The entire incident was recorded, and I have video evidence of everything that happened. Sergeant Williams read through Maria's notes quickly, her expression getting more serious with each line. She had seen a lot of things during her career, but it never got easier to deal with officers who violated their oath and betrayed the public's trust. Officers Miller and Davis, Sergeant Williams said, turning to face the 2 men. You're both under arrest for assault, sexual harassment, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. Being arrested by his own colleagues was like a nightmare come true. He had always thought that other cops would protect him, that they would stick together no matter what happened. Now he was discovering that serious crimes couldn't be covered up, even when they were committed by police officers. Sergeant, please, Jake said, as one of the other officers approached him with handcuffs. Can't we handle this internally? I know I made a mistake, but I've got a family. I've got kids. This will ruin my life. Sergeant Williams looked at him with disgust. You should have thought about your family before you decided to assault a woman on the street. You should have considered the consequences before you abused your authority. Tony was standing very still, staring at the ground. He knew that there was no point in arguing or trying to make excuses. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and he had witnessed Jake's behavior many times before. He was just as guilty as his partner, even if he hadn't been the one to actually grab Maria's skirt. Officer Davis, Sergeant Williams said, do you have anything to say about what happened here tonight? Tony looked up with tears in his eyes. I know what we did was wrong. I should have stopped him. I should have reported his behavior a long time ago. I'm sorry. Being sorry isn't enough, Maria said, speaking directly to Tony for the first time since the other officers had arrived. Your apology doesn't undo the trauma you've caused to all the women you've harassed. It doesn't erase the fear and humiliation they felt because of your actions. She walked closer to Tony, and he could see the anger in her eyes. You had a choice every single time your partner did something wrong. You could have been a real police officer and protected innocent people from him. Instead, you chose to be his accomplice. The other officers who had arrived with Sergeant Williams were watching the scene with a mixture of shock and disappointment. Most cops tried to do their jobs honestly and serve their communities with honor. When they saw colleagues like Jake and Tony, it reflected badly on all of them. Officer Patricia Chen, who had been on the force for 8 years, shook her head as she watched Jake being handcuffed. I've heard rumors about these two for years, she said quietly to her partner. I wish someone had done something about it sooner. Her partner, Officer Robert Johnson, nodded in agreement. The whole department is going to suffer because of their actions. People already don't trust cops enough, and when stories like this get out, it makes things worse for all of us. Maria overheard their conversation and turned to address all the officers present. This is exactly why internal affairs exists. We're not here to persecute good cops or to make your jobs harder. We're here to identify and remove the officers who give everyone else a bad name. She gestured toward Jake and Tony. These men have been terrorizing people in this community for years. Every time they got away with their behavior, they became bolder and more dangerous. If we hadn't caught them tonight, how much worse would their actions have become? Sergeant Williams finished reading Maria the standard procedures for filing her complaint and gathering evidence. Detective, I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow morning to give your full statement. We'll also need to review the recording you mentioned. Of course, Maria replied. I have everything documented, including a list of the previous complaints that have been filed against both of these officers. This incident is part of a larger pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. Jake was placed in the back of one patrol car, while Tony was put in another. As they were driven away, both men realized that their careers in law enforcement were over. They would likely spend time in prison. Their families would be embarrassed and financially devastated, and they would have to live with the knowledge that they had betrayed everything they had sworn to protect. Maria watched the patrol cars disappear into the night, then turned to Sergeant Williams. How long do you think it will take for this case to go to trial? Depends on a lot of factors, the sergeant replied. But with video evidence and your testimony, I'd say the prosecutors will have a strong case. These guys will probably try to plea bargain to avoid a long prison sentence. I hope the victims of their previous harassment will be willing to come forward now, Maria said. Knowing that these officers have been arrested might give other women the courage to speak up about what happened to them. Sergeant Williams nodded. Internal Affairs will be reaching out to everyone who filed complaints against Miller and Davis. Now that we have solid evidence of their misconduct, we can reopen those previous cases and see if we can get justice for those victims too. As the other officers began to leave the scene, Maria felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was glad that 2 corrupt officers had been caught and would face punishment for their crimes, but she was also aware that this was just one small victory in a much larger battle against police misconduct. Detective Rodriguez, Sergeant Williams said before getting back in her car, I want you to know that what you did tonight took real courage. A lot of people would have just revealed their identity immediately to stop the harassment. By letting it continue and documenting their behavior, you've given us the evidence we need to put these guys away. Maria smiled for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun. That's what we're here for, Sergeant. To protect and serve just like we promised when we took our oath. As she walked back toward her car, Maria thought about all the women who had been victimized by Jake and Tony over the years. Tonight's arrest wouldn't undo the damage that had already been done, but it would prevent these officers from hurting anyone else in the future. She also thought about the honest cops like Sergeant Williams and Officer Chen, who did their jobs with integrity and truly cared about their communities. They were the ones who would have to work extra hard to rebuild trust with the public after incidents like this one. Justice had been served tonight, but Maria knew that the real work was just beginning. 3 months later, Maria sat in a courtroom watching as Jake Miller and Tony Davis were sentenced for their crimes. The legal process had moved quickly because the evidence against them was so clear and overwhelming. Both men had eventually pleaded guilty to avoid longer prison sentences, but they were still facing serious consequences for their actions. The judge, Honorable Margaret Foster, had presided over many cases involving police misconduct during her 15 years on the bench. She had seen officers who made honest mistakes and others who deliberately abused their power. Jake and Tony clearly fell into the second category. Officer Miller, Judge Foster said, looking directly at Jake, "You had 15 years to serve this community with honor and integrity. Instead, you chose to use your position of authority to intimidate and victimize innocent people. Your actions have not only harmed your direct victims, but they have also damaged the reputation of every honest police officer in this city." Jake stood silently as the judge continued. His lawyer had advised him not to speak unless directly asked a question. His wife and children were sitting in the back of the courtroom, and he could feel their disappointment and shame without even looking at them. "Officer Davis," the judge continued, turning to Tony, "while you may not have been the primary aggressor in this case, your willingness to participate in and enable your partner's behavior makes you equally responsible. A good police officer would have stopped this harassment, not joined in it." Tony wiped away tears as he listened to the judge's words. Over the past 3 months, he had had plenty of time to think about his choices and regret his decisions. But he knew that his regret couldn't undo the harm he had caused. During the investigation that followed their arrest, 6 more women had come forward to report harassment by Jake and Tony. These victims had been afraid to speak up before because they didn't think anyone would believe them or take their complaints seriously. But when they heard that the officers had been arrested, they found the courage to tell their stories. One of these women, a college student named Ashley Thompson, was sitting in the courtroom to watch the sentencing. She had been walking home from her job at a local restaurant when Jake and Tony had stopped her and made inappropriate comments about her appearance. They had threatened to arrest her for imaginary crimes unless she was nicer to them. Ashley had filed a complaint with the police department, but it had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. She had felt helpless and angry, wondering if these officers were still out there harassing other women. Now she finally felt like justice was being served. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said when it was time for sentencing recommendations, "the state believes that both defendants should receive prison sentences that reflect the serious nature of their crimes. Police officers are held to a higher standard because they are entrusted with protecting the public. When they violate that trust, they must face appropriate consequences." The defense lawyers for both men had tried to argue for lighter sentences, claiming that their clients were good family men who had made mistakes and learned from them. But the evidence of their repeated misconduct made it difficult to portray them as victims of circumstance. "Officer Miller," Judge Foster announced, "I sentence you to 3 years in state prison, followed by 2 years of probation. You are permanently barred from working in law enforcement or any position of public trust." Jake's wife started crying quietly in the back of the courtroom. Their family's financial situation would be difficult with him in prison, and she would have to explain to their children why their father was going away. "Officer Davis," the judge continued, "I sentence you to 18 months in state prison, followed by 3 years of probation. Like your former partner, you are permanently banned from law enforcement." Tony's sentence was slightly lighter because he had cooperated with investigators and shown genuine remorse for his actions, but he was still going to prison, and his career was still over. After the sentencing, Maria met with some of the victims outside the courthouse. Ashley thanked her for having the courage to see the case through to the end. "If you hadn't been there that night," Ashley said, "these guys would still be out there hurting people. I'm grateful that someone finally stopped them." Maria shook Ashley's hand. "I'm sorry that you and the other victims had to go through this. You all deserved better from the officers who were supposed to protect you." The case had attracted significant media attention, and several news organizations had interviewed Maria about the arrest and investigation. She had used these opportunities to talk about the importance of police accountability and the need for citizens to report misconduct when they witnessed it. One of the most important things people need to understand, Maria had told a local television reporter, is that the vast majority of police officers are honest, hardworking people who care about their communities. But when we find officers who abuse their power, We have to take action to remove them from positions where they can cause harm. The police department had also made changes in response to the case. All officers were now required to undergo additional training on appropriate conduct and respect for citizens' rights. The complaint process for reporting police misconduct had been simplified and made more accessible to the public. Chief of Police Robert Martinez had issued a statement after the sentencing, saying that the department was committed to rebuilding trust with the community and ensuring that all officers met the highest standards of professional conduct. We cannot change what Officers Miller and Davis did, Chief Martinez had said, but we can learn from this incident and work to prevent similar situations in the future. Every officer in this department has a responsibility to serve with honor and to hold their colleagues accountable when they fail to meet our standards. Maria had been promoted to lieutenant in recognition of her excellent work on the case. Her new position gave her more authority to investigate police misconduct and implement reforms within the department. She had also been invited to speak at police academies and training conferences around the state, sharing her experience in helping to educate new officers about the importance of ethical behavior and accountability. The badge and uniform don't make you better than anyone else, Maria would tell the new recruits during her presentations. They give you the responsibility to serve and protect everyone in your community, regardless of their race, gender, or social status. If you can't handle that responsibility, you shouldn't be a police officer. 6 months after the sentencing, Maria received a letter from Ashley Thompson, who had graduated from college and started a career in social work. Ashley wrote that the experience of seeing Jake and Tony held accountable for their actions had inspired her to work with other victims of abuse and help them find their voice. Showed me that sometimes justice does work, Ashley wrote, and that there are still good people out there fighting for what's right. I want to do the same thing in my own way. Maria kept the letter on her desk as a reminder of why her work was important. Every case she investigated, every corrupt officer she removed from the force, and every victim she helped had the potential to make the community a little bit safer and more just. The story of what happened on Oak Street that night had spread throughout the police department and the community. It served as a warning to any officer who might be tempted to abuse their power, and as a source of hope for citizens who had lost faith in law enforcement. Maria knew that there would always be more work to do. There would always be officers who made bad choices and victims who needed someone to fight for them. But she also knew that every small victory mattered, and that standing up for what was right was always worth the effort. As she sat in her office reviewing the files of her next case, Maria thought about the oath she had taken when she first became a police officer years ago. She had promised to serve and protect, to uphold justice, and to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. That night on Oak Street, she had kept all of those promises, and she would continue keeping them for as long as she wore the badge.